So these are largely anecdotal, but I think these give you an idea about this tension between bringing states into this supranational organization and then this tendency for the states to demand some sort of devolution of power in the process. And they're trying to balance this, and it's very complicated. So the first example relates to identity versus efficiency. There are about 23 official languages in the European Union, which are also all working languages. What that means is that any document to the EU institutions can be drafted in any language, and they have to respond in that language. This is important because it's an effort by these EU states to come together, but at the same time preserve their national identities. So all major legislation and all regulations, as well as are also drafted in every language, and they're published in this official journal of the European Union in these 23 official languages. The European Commission can use just procedural languages, English, French, and German, but the European Parliament is fully multilingual. So last time I checked, and this was a while ago, the cost of this was about 1.1 billion euro, which was then about $1.4 billion. This was 2005, which was when the last report was done, to actually do this. That's 1% of the EU's annual general budget just to maintain this. And again, it's a struggle between showing that we are sovereign and our own unique people, and showing that we belong to something bigger. So almost anecdotal, but with serious consequences. A second example here is this, which highlights the struggle to create a European identity without sacrificing these national identities in another way. The European Union has strived to increase the level of political and economic integration of its members. European elites promoted an EU-wide constitution. This was highly supported by elites around Europe, but opposed by populations within Europe. And sorry for this slide, but we'll come to this in a minute. So in June of 2005, they had these obligatory referenda. You had to hold a referendum. It had to be unanimous in all EU states for this constitution to pass. And it ended very quickly with rejections in France and Holland. So in 2007, what do? Well, they use a backdoor, and they created the Treaty of Lisbon, which more or less said many of the same things as the Constitution, but it had only to be signed by leaders, not the populations. And this came into force in December of 2009. So that's a political example. Now, another example of identity versus, at this point, independent symbols and control of the economy is the euro. The idea of the euro was that you could get economic benefits. You could simplify things using one price measure, which would increase competition. It would stimulate trade by lowering prices, having fewer transaction costs. You don't have to exchange money and all that kind of stuff. And this would increase cross-border investment. It was also, though, designed to help foster an EU-wide identity. The money has images on it. These are pictures. So each banknote is dedicated to some artistic period of European architecture. So you've got windows and gateways on the front, bridges on the back. Now, they're not supposed to resemble any particular country, but rather be generic. So there have been actually changes because some pictures were seen as too close to a particular landmark, one in Venice, one in Paris, and so they had to make some, changes in the political discussion. In other words, people have attacked them for having these sorts of things. But generally, they're supposed to be generic. The idea is that no one European country trumps in the Eurozone. But think about what this means. If you adopt the euro, you're doing a couple things. From a very concrete standpoint, let's start with the problem of getting into the EU currency, the Eurozone. You need to surrender lots of power. The deficit in your country can't exceed 3% of the GDP. That means if you're having a bad year, you can't have increased social spending like we did in the US during the financial crisis. So it limits your fiscal policy. Your total public debt is capped at 60% of your GDP. So again, you can't spend much more than you have. And the idea is that you need to keep the euro stable. But what this means is that you lose elements of fiscal policy, the freedom of fiscal policy. You can't spend more. You also lose elements with respect to monetary policy. Sorry, blanking. So you lose the power to print money, set your own interest rates. And so we've seen lots of places that have, Denmark and Sweden held referenda, and they rejected joining the euro. The UK is also not a member. But again, from another standpoint, think about what this means. If you're adopting the euro and you're abandoning your currency, you're abandoning the pound with all the pictures of your historic kings and queens, right? And instead, you're picking up these generic pictures of something that looks European, but isn't tied to any particular state. So you're giving up a sort of sense of yourself. Imagine if we gave up George Washington on the dollar bill to have I don't know, a window or a gateway from Canada that looks something like what you saw in Canada or Mexico, if we had a union like that. So this is another problem that you encounter. There are all sorts of problems with being in the Eurozone during times of crisis, as we've seen in the most recent years. For example, Germany's deficit was more than 4% of GDP in 2011, which leads to a credibility problem. Others can scratch their heads and say, hey, how come Germany can do this and they don't get in trouble? So there are lots of potential problems. It's also important to emphasize that 17 countries use the euro. So that's just more than half of the 27 members of the EU. So not far from every country in the European Union is a member of the Eurozone, which is a very important point, especially today when we talk about the euro crisis. So this highlights the Eurozone rules. So now we could talk about EU expansion, which I mistakenly mentioned the 1995 case before. So I apologize for that. Clearly, the color is purple, and this refers to Finland, Sweden, and Austria. The point here is that there are lots of wannabes from an economic standpoint to get into the EU, and there are good reasons to get into the EU. You get lots of money for preparation. They're known as structural adjustment funds, and for early adaptation once you're actually in the EU. So because they're poor, Greece, Spain, and Portugal got tons of money when they came in. So Greece came in again in 1981, and Spain and Portugal in 1986. The money keeps coming. They've been members since the 1980s, but they still receive structural adjustment funds. Not even discussing what's gone on in the last couple of years when they've gotten bailouts during the economic crisis. But it's not a surprise that these are the countries that needed bailouts. These are the weak links, especially Greece and Spain. So these structural adjustment funds are basically money to help any member state whose gross national product is less than 90% of the average EU gross national product. It's a very costly program. Between 2004 and 2006, they put almost $18 billion into it for those three countries, as well as all the new members coming from Central Europe. And it's very controversial among old members. And it leads to much bargaining. You have to bargain your way into the European Union. And part of this is how much your money you're going to need to get in. So the Central European states, okay, which goes all the way down here, the states right here, these are the ones who have really counted on this money to equalize them and bring them into the EU as full members. Now, there's also a question of values. So two important issues. Economics is one and values is another. In the post-communist world, given the experience of communism, people have swung there like a pendulum from an emphasis on civil rights to an emphasis on civil liberties. And so in many ways, they're somewhat more U.S.-like in terms of their economic policies, liberalism, than European-like. And politically, they're much more pro-freedom and pro-liberties. And this is played out, for example, in the war in Iraq, where you had many Central European. Poland was, I think, our number 3 or our number 4 supporter in Iraq, for example. And other countries in the region also sent weapons and sent people, soldiers, to fight in Iraq. This was something that some of the older European states didn't like, older EU states, I should say, didn't like. And they spoke disparagingly about the new EU states during this period. So the communist countries came in 2 tranches so far. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Slovenia. All these countries came in the first wave in 2004, along with Cyprus down here. And then then you had a second wave in 2007, which brought in Romania and Bulgaria. Which brings us to the next question. Is the EU workable? Well, in a 2009 European Commission report, they attacked both Bulgaria and Romania 2 years after they came in for failure to fight money laundering, for vote buying during European and national elections, for fraud and organized crime-related killings. These things aren't supposed to happen in the European Union. They lamented the slow pace of change, especially the lack of convictions in high-profile corruption cases. It got so bad that Bulgaria lost EU aid for economic and administrative reforms for a period. It was about $710 million worth. And both these countries, Bulgaria and Romania, were booted out of the Schengen zone, the passport-free travel zone. Remember the one that the Swiss were so tortured about when they held their national referendum. So now they're coming back in. Romania is doing better than Bulgaria, but the EU says that its reform efforts remain fragmented. There's a risk that this could slow down the entry of other states, like Croatia and Iceland, into the EU. This is a big downside. Okay, let's talk about the upside first. The upside is that these countries both would have likely been in much worse shape if they hadn't joined. They're certainly doing better than Moldova or the Ukraine, and they're still on the EU borders, so you want to have good, strong, stable states on your borders. The downside is that when you have members like this and it slows down the process of integration or potentially calls the process of integration into question altogether, well, then you have many countries that have less reason to make the reforms that would make them more strong and stable places. And Croatia, Serbia, for example, and without these incentives, these places can turn into what we call basket cases. That's a technical term. And they can be very problematic. Turkey is another question. You've had lots of questions about bringing a Muslim country into the European Union. Most European states won't admit it, but opinion polls suggest that this does play a role. And the reaction to this can be a devolution. Again, trying to bring back power to local levels, to lower levels. So bring it back from the EU to national power. If we're talking about statewide, bring it down to local power. Give leaders closer to the people, who are therefore more accountable to the people, greater power. And again, remember that the European Union institutions are several steps removed from voters. Sometimes this might involve creating new political institutions. In Canada, for instance, clearly not a member of the EU, they created a new province in 1999 for native Inuits. But there are other ways that this can be done, giving more fiscal autonomy, giving more political autonomy. Now, the problem with devolution is that you could ultimately undermine capacity and the autonomy of the state, or in this case, of the supranational organization. Just to bring up a couple controversies that sort of characterize the EU. One is immigration. This is a huge source of social change, and that's what this picture is right here. Immigrants can bring essential skills and economic capabilities to the market, but they can also bring conflict. And remember, with the rising age, many of these European countries need either to have more immigrants or more babies. And through social expenditures, many of them have struggled to have more babies instead of more immigrants. So the poster that you see here is the quintessential Polish plumber. During that constitutional referendum in France that I mentioned, they showed this Polish plumber invading France, taking all the jobs. So there were lots of posters, there were TV ads talking about the Polish plumber, the quintessential Central European who's going to come and take all the jobs if this referendum goes through. The picture that you see here is when the Polish tourism reacted with their own poster saying, "I'm staying in Poland. Come in large numbers. We invite you," essentially. So it's just kind of a play on that. But there are other daily controversies. Do you demand assimilation, or do you pride yourselves on multiculturalism? In 2004, you had huge protests in France when the headscarf was banned from secondary schools in order to ensure secularism, the separation of the church and state. The pressure continued beyond this. One university student commented, "We are studying to be able to work later, and we all know that if you wear a veil, all the doors will close." So there are these social norms that are really pressed as well. Now, the result is that across the European Union, you found right-wing parties that have won big in recent elections. They don't tend to preach hatred. They're not like the Nazis. They're much more subtle. It's civilized bigotry. Clamp down on immigration. Restrict the rights on immigrant residents. One strike and you get deported. They talk of religion as a dangerous ideology. Okay. And the last picture that I have here is those who are resistant to join the EU. So you've got the Swiss nationalists here. A couple European countries have stayed out of the EU or EU structures. And here I'm talking about the Schengen zone or the Euro. Norway, for example, hasn't joined. It's been unpopular. Sweden, not long ago, decided to join, but with reservations. Switzerland, which prides itself on neutrality, here the Swiss People's Party really shows the spillover effect. In 2007, they also had a far-right party, the Swiss People's Party, that took power. They won the largest share of the national vote of any party since 1919. Okay, so this is a spillover effect of EU-wide issues and things that are going to affect Switzerland, whether they're a member of the EU or not. So all of these things are important to keep in mind when we talk about the largest block of advanced democracies in the world. Here we're talking about trying to create some union between these states, and it's come up against these various tensions. So that's all for the advanced democracies. Now you've got an idea of how the largest block of advanced democracies has evolved and how it's worked and some of the problems in it. So that's it.